The courtroom was full that morning. People sat quietly on wooden benches, some waiting for their cases, others just watching. The judge, a middle-aged white man with cold eyes and a sharp tongue, entered with confidence. Everyone stood. Then they sat again as he took his seat. In the corner of the courtroom, a teenage black girl named Amira sat beside her mother. Her hands were folded in her lap, her head slightly down. She wore a plain dress and simple shoes. Her mother looked nervous, holding a worn-out file tightly. The judge glanced at them, then smirked. He called out, Case 103. Mrs. Tanya Williams versus Landco Rentals. Amira's mother stood up slowly. Her knees were weak, but she held on. She had been wrongly kicked out of her apartment, and today was her chance to speak. But she didn't have a lawyer. She couldn't afford one. The judge leaned forward and said, "No lawyer again, Mrs. Williams. Or did you bring your daughter to speak for you?" A few people in the courtroom laughed. Amira looked up, her dark eyes calm but focused. She didn't say anything. Her mother spoke softly, "Your Honor, I can explain." But the judge raised a hand. "Explain. I've heard this story before. People like you always have excuses." More laughter followed. Someone in the back shook their head and whispered, "They should know better." Amira's heart beat fast, but she didn't show fear. She had seen her mother struggle for years, working double shifts, facing rude landlords, and being treated like dirt. Today, she promised herself she wouldn't let that happen again. The judge continued, "You say you were evicted unfairly. Where's the proof? Where's the contract? The documents?" Her mother opened the file, trying to find the papers. Her hands shook. A few papers slipped and fell to the ground. The courtroom chuckled again. "Unbelievable," the judge muttered. That's when Amira stood up. She picked up the papers slowly, then looked straight at the judge. Her voice was clear. "Your Honor, the contract is right here. It clearly states that my mother must receive a 30-day notice before eviction. She was given only 5 days." The judge stared at her. "And who are you?" "Her lawyer," he asked, sarcastically. Amira didn't blink. "No, sir, just her daughter." The judge smirked. "Then sit down, little girl. This is not a school debate." The courtroom burst into laughter again. But Amira stayed standing. Section 9B of the rental agreement is clear. And according to state law, an eviction without proper notice is illegal. Silence. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Where did you learn that?" Amira looked at him and said, "I read it. I study law. For fun." A few people chuckled again, but this time it sounded nervous. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Well, aren't you smart? Maybe you think you know more than the court." Amira calmly replied, "No, sir, but I know enough to defend my mother." The courtroom went quiet. The judge shuffled some papers. After the short break, the courtroom slowly filled again. But something felt different. The same people who had laughed at Amira earlier were now whispering. Some looked back at her with curiosity, others with disbelief. Even the court officers glanced at her with raised eyebrows. Judge Ronald came back and sat on his high seat. He didn't smile this time. He picked up the contract Amira had pointed to before and studied it again. His eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Williams," he said, "do you understand the paper your daughter showed me?" Amira's mother looked confused. I don't know, sir. I just signed whatever the landlord gave me." The judge turned to Amira. "And you are saying this paper protects her from eviction?" Amira stood again, calm, confident. "Yes, Your Honor. According to Section 9B of this agreement, my mother should have received 30 days' notice. She was only given 5. I also have a copy of the notice she received." She pulled out another paper from the file. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Ronald took the paper from the officer and read it. His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything at first. Finally, he asked, "And how exactly did you learn this, Miss?" "Amira," she replied. I learned by studying online law courses. I watched real trials. I read rental laws. I just wanted to help my mother." Someone in the courtroom gasped. The same people who laughed earlier were now sitting straight. Some leaned forward to listen. A young woman whispered to her friend, "She's smarter than most lawyers I've seen." Judge Ronald cleared his throat. He didn't like losing control, especially not to a teenager, especially not one he had mocked. "Even if that's true," he said coldly, "this is still a courtroom. You are not a lawyer." Amira nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand. But I also know that truth doesn't need a license to be spoken." A few people clapped softly before the judge banged his gavel. "Order. This is not a performance." But his voice didn't have the same power as before. The judge turned to the landlord's lawyer, a tall man in an expensive suit. "Do you have anything to say about this claim?" The lawyer stood, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, Your Honor, we did send a notice. Maybe there was a mistake in the dates." Amira interrupted gently. "I also have a copy of the building's security footage. It shows the notice being taped to the door just 5 days before the eviction, not 30. Gasps filled the room. The judge stared at her. "How did you get that?" "I asked the building guard," Amira replied. "He let me take a picture of the security log. I also have his written statement." Judge Ronald's lips tightened. His face was red now, but he tried to stay calm. Outside the courtroom, a local news reporter who was covering a different case peeked in. He had heard the buzz in the hallway and decided to check for himself. He saw Amira standing confidently, a teenage girl, outsmarting a lawyer, making a judge nervous, defending her mother. He quickly pulled out his phone and began taking notes. Inside, Amira sat down beside her mother again. Her mother whispered, "How did you know what to say?" Amira smiled. "I didn't. I just told the truth." Across the courtroom, someone stood quietly near the door. A woman in a gray blazer. No one had noticed her enter. She was from the State Bar Association. She had heard about a teen girl lawyer and wanted to see for herself. She watched Amira carefully and was deeply impressed. Judge Ronald leaned back in his chair. He knew the girl was right, but he hated being wrong, especially in front of a crowd. Still, the facts were the facts. "This case will be reviewed further," he said sharply. "Court is adjourned for now." He banged the gavel and stood up quickly, walking out before anyone could ask more questions. As people began to leave, many stopped by Amira's seat. A woman said, "You should be a lawyer, sweetheart." A man added, "You've got talent, kid." Amira smiled politely, but stayed humble. She wasn't doing this for attention. She just wanted her mother to have justice. But what she didn't know was that someone important was watching. And in the next hearing, everything would change. The next morning, Amira sat on the small couch in their apartment, holding a cup of tea. Her mother sat beside her, silent, lost in thoughts. Last night had been strange. People kept messaging Amira on social media, calling her the girl lawyer, and sharing short clips someone had recorded in the courtroom. Amira didn't care about going viral. She only cared about one thing, making sure her mom was safe and respected. Suddenly, her phone rang. The number was unknown. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello." A calm voice spoke. "Is this Amira Hassan?" "Yes. This is Claire Anderson from the State Bar Association. I was in the courtroom yesterday. I saw what you did." Amira froze. I was just helping my mother." Claire smiled over the phone. "Yes, and you did it better than some lawyers I know. I want to meet you, if you're okay with that." Amira looked at her mother, wide-eyed. Her mom whispered, "Say yes." "Yes," Amira said quickly. "I'd be honored." "Great. Let's meet before your next court hearing. I believe Judge Ronald has rescheduled it for tomorrow. I'll be there too." The call ended, but Amira's hands were shaking. What did this woman want? Was it good news or bad? The next day came fast. The courthouse looked the same, but this time people were waiting outside with cameras. Reporters, bloggers, even law students. Someone shouted, "Is this the teenage lawyer?" Amira kept her head down. She didn't like all the attention. Inside the courtroom, Judge Ronald sat still, looking serious. The courtroom was packed. Claire Anderson stood quietly in the back, her sharp eyes never leaving Amira. Judge Ronald began the session. This court has reviewed new evidence submitted by Ms. Amira Hassan. The notice was indeed served too late. According to state law, the eviction is invalid. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Ronald held up his hand. But I must also say, this courtroom is not a playground. And Amira Hassan is not a licensed attorney. She cannot represent her mother formally. Amira lowered her eyes. She had expected this. But Claire Anderson stood. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I would like to make a request." Judge Ronald looked annoyed. "And who are you?" "I'm Claire Anderson from the State Bar. And I'm here to offer Amira Hassan a full scholarship to the state's pre-law internship program. We believe her talent should not be ignored." Gasps filled the room. Amira looked up, shocked. "Me?" "Yes, you," Claire replied. "You have potential. We want to train you, guide you. You'll have real mentors, real courtroom experience. And when you're ready, law school will be waiting." Judge Ronald looked uncomfortable. He didn't expect this. Amira's mother began crying. Not out of fear, but pride. Judge Ronald cleared his throat. "Well, that's unexpected." Claire smiled. "Yes, but so was Amira." The judge looked at Amira. "Young lady, I may not agree with how you handled this, but I cannot deny your skill. You surprised me." That was the closest thing to an apology he could give. Amira stood slowly. Her voice was calm. "Thank you, Your Honor. I only wanted justice." The judge nodded. Justice was served. As the hearing ended, Amira stepped out of the courtroom. Reporters surrounded her, asking questions, but all she said was, "I'm not a lawyer yet, but I will be." The story didn't end there. That night, Amira's name was trending online. People shared her photo with captions like "future lawyer" and "teen who shook the courtroom." But in a quiet corner of her heart, Amira remembered one thing. She had done it for her mother. And this was just the beginning of her journey. Amira sat quietly on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her life had changed overnight. A week ago, no one knew her name. Now, people from all over the country were talking about her, some cheering her bravery, others questioning her presence in a courtroom. But Amira didn't care about fame. She only cared about justice. Still, something bothered her. It wasn't the judge. It wasn't the reporters. It was a sentence, a cruel one, spoken in front of everyone. "You're just an uneducated girl pretending to be smart." That sentence had stayed in her heart like a wound that wouldn't heal. She remembered how the judge had laughed, how people had stared, not because they knew her, but because of her skin, her background, and her clothes. She wasn't from a rich family. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wasn't supposed to belong. But she did. And now she was going to prove it. The next morning, Amira walked into the State Bar office building with Claire Anderson. It was her first day in the pre-law program. The building was modern, the walls lined with books, legal quotes, and framed photos of famous lawyers. Claire gave her a tour. "This is where you'll train, learn, and practice. You'll meet mentors. You'll work on real cases." Amira nodded silently. She was nervous, but ready. Claire stopped walking and looked at her. "You know, the first time I walked into a courtroom, I was shaking. People laughed at me too." Amira's eyes widened. "You?" "Yes," Claire smiled. "Because I was a woman. Because I came from a small town. But I didn't let them define me. And neither should you." Those words gave Amira strength. Later that week, Claire gave Amira her first assignment. Read this case file. Then write what you think the verdict should be, and why. Amira stayed up all night studying. She wrote down everything, every little detail, then rewrote it twice to make it better. The next morning, she gave it to Claire. Claire read it slowly. Her eyes didn't blink. When she finished, she looked up. "This is excellent," she said. "You think like a lawyer already." Amira smiled. For the first time, she believed it. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, something unexpected happened. Judge Ronald was being watched. The courtroom clip of him mocking Amira had gone viral. People were calling out his behavior. Letters and emails flooded the court office. Some even demanded he step down. He sat alone in his chamber, watching the same video everyone else had seen. He saw himself smirking. He heard himself say, "This girl is uneducated." Now he felt shame. He had judged a girl by her looks, by her age, by her silence. But she had been smarter than him. He called for a meeting with the court board. In a quiet voice, he said, "I want to apologize to Amira Hassan. I treated her unfairly." The board was shocked. Judge Ronald never apologized to anyone. But he meant it. That weekend, Amira received a letter from the courthouse. It had the court seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It read, "Dear Amira Hassan, I owe you an apology. You walked into my courtroom to protect your mother with nothing but knowledge and courage. You proved that justice is not about age, color, or background. It's about truth. I was wrong. You were right. Sincerely, Judge Ronald." Tears filled Amira's eyes. She handed the letter to her mother, who hugged her tightly. "You didn't just win a case," her mother whispered. "You changed hearts." Amira looked out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance. She knew her journey was far from over. There would be more battles, more doubts. But now, she had something stronger than fear. She had purpose. The courtroom was packed. News reporters, lawyers, and even law students filled the seats. Everyone had come to see her, the teenage girl who had once been laughed at. Amira Hassan walked in slowly, her face calm but focused. This time, she wasn't there to defend her mother. She had been invited back. Not as a witness, not as a defendant, but as a guest speaker. The courtroom that once laughed at her now stood and clapped as she walked in. Even Judge Ronald was there, sitting quietly, watching. He had personally invited Amira to speak at a Justice and Youth event, something the court had never done before. Amira stood at the front, wearing a simple navy blue dress. She didn't wear fancy jewelry. She didn't need to. Her presence was powerful enough. She looked at the crowd, took a deep breath, and spoke into the microphone. "When I first came to this courtroom," she began, "I was scared. Not because of the law, but because I thought no one would listen to someone like me. People leaned in closer. My mother was in trouble. I had studied her case for weeks. I knew she was innocent. But when I stood here, the judge laughed at me." The audience turned to Judge Ronald for a moment. He nodded slightly, taking responsibility. "But I didn't give up," Amira continued, "because justice is not a game. It's not about how old you are, what you wear, or where you come from." Her voice grew stronger. "It's about truth." She paused. The room was silent. "I studied that case like my future depended on it, because it did. My mother's freedom, my belief in justice, and my dignity were all on trial." Some people in the room had tears in their eyes. Amira smiled slightly and looked at the young girls sitting in the back rows. "I want every girl, every teenager watching this to know, you belong here, in this room, in this system, in this fight." The room burst into applause. After the speech, Judge Ronald slowly walked up to Amira. His face was not arrogant anymore. It was humble. "You reminded me what justice truly means," he said softly. "I judged you, but now I admire you." Amira nodded politely. "Thank you, Your Honor." He handed her a certificate. It read, Honorary Youth Legal Advocate, Amira Hassan. The audience clapped again. For once, the courtroom didn't feel like a cold place of punishment. It felt like a place of hope. Outside, the cameras flashed as reporters rushed to her. Amira, how did you do it? What kept you going when everyone laughed at you? She looked into the camera and said only one thing. Because I knew I was right, and I refused to be silent. That evening, back at home, Amira placed the certificate beside her books. Her mom watched her from the kitchen and smiled. You've always been special, her mother said, walking over and hugging her. Now the world knows it too. Amira hugged her back. This is just the beginning. And it was, because a year later, Amira was accepted into one of the country's top law programs for gifted youth. She didn't just plan to become a lawyer. She planned to change the system so that no girl, no teen, no child would ever be silenced again in a courtroom. Months passed. Amira was now studying at a prestigious law program for gifted youth. Her story had become an inspiration. Schools, colleges, even judges talked about the girl who silenced the courtroom. But something unexpected happened one afternoon. A letter arrived. It wasn't from a fan. It wasn't from the media. It was from Judge Ronald. Amira held the envelope in her hand for a long time before opening it. She still remembered how that man had mocked her in court, but she also remembered the moment he clapped for her and gave her that certificate. She opened the letter slowly. It began, Dear Amira, the day you first stood in my courtroom, I saw a girl trying to do something adults had failed to do, fight for justice with truth and heart. I laughed. I judged you, and I was wrong. Your courage, your research, and your belief in justice shook not just the courtroom, but me. I write to you today not as a judge, but as a man who wants to learn. Would you be willing to meet with me? I want to hear more. I want to change. I want your help. Yours sincerely, Judge Ronald Beck. Amira stared at the letter for a while. She read it again and again. Her mom walked in and saw her daughter holding the paper tightly. What is it? She asked gently. Amira looked up with a strange mix of surprise and calm. A man who once called me uneducated, she said softly, is now asking me to teach him. Her mom sat down beside her, holding back tears. Do you want to meet him? She asked. Amira nodded. Yes, not because I need to prove anything, but because the system doesn't change with silence. A week later, Amira met Judge Ronald in a small coffee shop near the court. He had no robe, no guards, just a notebook and a humble look on his face. They spoke for hours. He asked questions. She answered honestly. They talked about the flaws in the system, about how poor families were treated, about how many brilliant voices never get heard just because they don't look the part. By the end of the meeting, Ronald said, Would you help me create a mentorship program inside the courthouse for young minds like yours? Amira didn't hesitate. Yes, let's build something that outlives us both. Within months, a new program launched. Youth Voices in Justice. Teenagers from all over the city came to learn about law, rights, justice, and how to speak up. Amira was its first leader. And Judge Ronald. He sat in the back row during every session, taking notes like a student. One day, after a long session, a young girl approached Amira. She had tears in her eyes and said, I want to be like you one day. Amira smiled gently and replied, No, you'll be better than me. Final message to the audience. People laughed at her in court. They called her uneducated, but she didn't shout. She didn't fight back with anger. She used truth. She used knowledge. And she used grace. And that changed everything. She didn't just win her mother's case. She changed a judge. She built a program. And she inspired a generation. 2 years later, the courtroom was full again. But this time, no one was on trial. There was no case, no argument, No anger. Instead, the room was filled with people clapping, smiling, and crying. At the center stood Amira, now 18 years old, in a black dress with a small golden badge that read, Voice of Justice 2025. She had just been announced as the youngest recipient of the National Youth Justice Award, a rare honor given to someone who had changed the justice system at a young age. People from across the country had gathered. Lawyers, judges, students, even news reporters. And sitting in the front row was Judge Ronald Beck, proud and teary-eyed, clapping louder than anyone else. Next to him sat Amira's mother, holding her daughter's hand tightly. The host walked to the stage and said, This girl once stood here as a joke to many, but today we honor her as a giant in truth, wisdom, and heart. The crowd stood up. Standing ovation. Amira walked to the microphone. She looked nervous, but calm. She took a deep breath and began speaking, just like she had done in court years ago. I was once laughed at in this very room, she began. I didn't come from money. I didn't wear fancy clothes. I didn't speak with big words. But I spoke with truth. The room went completely silent. Even the cameras stopped clicking. That truth helped free my mother. It helped change a judge, and it helped build a bridge between the law and young people like me. Then she paused. Tears formed in her eyes, but she kept smiling. This award is not just mine. It belongs to every kid who is told they're too young, too poor, or too unimportant to be heard. She pointed to the crowd of young students in the back. Don't wait to grow up to fight for what's right. Sometimes your heart already knows more than the books do. People started crying quietly. Even the toughest-looking lawyers wiped their eyes. Judge Ronald stood up again and clapped. And this time, no one laughed. Everyone stood with him. As the ceremony ended, news cameras rushed forward. But Amira didn't care about the interviews. She walked straight to her mother, hugged her tightly, and whispered, We made it. Her mother smiled through tears and replied, No, baby, you made it. And the world finally saw who you really are. Later that night, as Amira sat alone with her award in her hands, she looked at a small notebook. It was her old court notes, the ones she had written before her first courtroom appearance. She flipped to the last page. In bold letters, she had written years ago, One day they will listen. And now, they had.